There's no such thing as free money, right? Wrong. At the start of the COVID pandemic last year, the federal government had to take urgent action to avoid economic oblivion. It came up with the JobKeeper scheme, a great success that gave struggling businesses billions of dollars to pay their workers. 700,000 jobs were saved. But more than 150,000 companies that weren't in trouble, many of them actually thriving, still stuck their hands out and received $13 billion taxpayer dollars. They didn't need it. It was money for nothing. Now, what the businesses were doing wasn't illegal, and they're allowed to keep the cash. But is it fair, or does it stink? You decide.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Jan from Frankston is an aged pensioner who works part-time as a teacher. She received JobKeeper and Centrelink is now demanding she repay more than $1,000.
Jan Raab is better known these days as Jan from Frankston, after the government overpaid her $1,000 of JobKeeper and then ordered her to give it back. But this part pensioner is no whinger and will repay the money. At $15 a fortnight, it'll take her 3 years. You accepted it was your obligation to pay it back. You'd been paid too much public money, so fair enough, it had to go back.
Yeah, because that's what I believe, that if you've been paid money and you're not entitled to it, that you should return that money.
Billions of dollars of JobKeeper were gifted to firms with rising earnings. Why is the Prime Minister not asking them to repay a single cent?
While the government is chasing Jan and 11,000 other welfare recipients for $30 million it says they shouldn't have, it doesn't seem interested in recouping a cent of the $13 billion of JobKeeper money that it gave to 157,000 businesses, which, far from suffering, actually saw turnover increase during the pandemic.
Those people didn't need government assistance. That's the fact. You can't reinvent that history.
Is there any difference between the Jans of Australia being asked to pay back their JobKeeper and these businesses and company bosses being asked to pay back theirs?
Well, the issue is that the businesses aren't being asked to pay back. We've quite clearly seen evidence that firms receive JobKeeper by design, absolutely legally, that didn't need it.
2 million Australians unemployed. That's the stark reality we could soon be facing.
I need to pay rent, need to eat.
No one needs reminding of the initial chaos COVID caused when it hit in March last year. As the first lockdowns were ordered, there was very real concern the economy would collapse. In response, the federal government threw money at the unfolding catastrophe and called it JobKeeper.
Now is the time to dig deep.
It was the largest one-off spending program in Australia's history, designed to keep people employed. Domino's chief executive, Don May, says it saved the country.
JobKeeper did a lot of good things for business when there was a lot of fear. We tore up the budget, beginning of the pandemic, and said, we're going to try and keep all of our franchisees whole and all of our employees to get to the other side. And JobKeeper allowed us to do that in that very early phase.
And like a Domino's pizza with the lot, JobKeeper was generous. For businesses expecting a downturn, Canberra gave them $1,500 a fortnight for each of their employees. Jan, a part-time teacher, received the benefit when the independent school she was working at applied for the money on behalf of its staff. When that JobKeeper first came through for you, when you first got that money, you must have thought, oh, this is terrific. This will really help.
Oh, my God. I thought it was more than Christmas. And I was really grateful because I've been, like a lot of people, I've done it pretty hard.
Dean Patch investigates the financial health of Australia's biggest companies on behalf of investors. When JobKeeper began, he immediately recognised its greatest shortcoming: how it might be exploited.
The scheme didn't have the right checks and balances. That's it in a heartbeat.
Depending on its size, a business qualified for 6 months of JobKeeper by demonstrating a 30 to 50% decline in sales from the previous March, or by forecasting a fall of the same size in the following quarter. But here's the thing. If that forecast turned out to be wrong and sales bounced back, the business still kept the money. There was no obligation to pay it back. When Dean realised his own financial advisory firm was eligible for the handout, even though it was far from struggling, he knew something was amiss. When did it first dawn on you that things weren't quite right with this scheme?
Well, we qualified, which astounded us. Our revenue is pretty much locked in, but because of a little hiccup, we were 35% down in cash in March, and we would have been able to get $195,000.
So you didn't apply for it. Clearly you didn't need it, but you could have hit the jackpot the way this thing was set up.
Absolutely, and there would have been absolutely no obligation on us to repay the money.
For thousands of businesses, JobKeeper became a government-sanctioned get-rich-quick scheme. The Parliamentary Budget Office has crunched the numbers, and a staggering $25 billion, nearly a third of the $89 billion spent on JobKeeper, went to companies that either didn't experience the required downturn or, incredibly, their sales went up. But under the rules of JobKeeper, these businesses are not legally obliged to pay back a single cent. You could forecast Armageddon, but in reality, you could end up very profitable, and as a result of a bad forecast, you would receive no penalty.
Well, that's what the data tells us. There are 157,000 firms that qualified for JobKeeper either on the basis of a temporary downturn in March or a forecast in the April to June period whose sales actually increased. That was $13 billion. There was no consequence whatsoever for you making an overly pessimistic forecast. And so that's a design either feature, if you're one of the businesses who've pocketed that, or it's a flaw if you're a taxpayer that's paying for it.
Let's be kind to them, shall we? I mean, it was a terrible time, the start of the pandemic. A lot of them would have been thinking, this is going to be very, very bad for us. So give them the benefit of the doubt. They took all the public money. But then, having done very, very well, thank you very much, they still haven't given it back because why? Because there's no legal obligation.
No, happy days. You can buy a JobKeeper ute, a JobKeeper holiday house, a JobKeeper yacht, and it's your money to spend.
And with such vast amounts of money being thrown about, another curious feature of the scheme was its lack of transparency. The government refused to provide a public list of companies that had qualified for the money. Their reason? Well, in June last year, former Finance Minister Matthias Cormann said doing so would discourage businesses from applying.
The public disclosure of businesses that are in receipt of JobKeeper could act as a disincentive also to participate in the program, which would reduce the support to workers. It is not necessary to publish the names of businesses to ensure that workers get paid their $1,500 JobKeeper payments. An employer must advise.
Unlike virtually every other Western democracy, there was no public register of who received JobKeeper. So the New Zealand scheme is a fantastic example. It was all there in the public domain, as it was in the US, as it was in the UK. We had nothing.
As JobKeeper was rolled out, Dean Patch also suspected vast amounts of public money was entering the bank accounts of Australia's biggest public companies. He knew it had the potential to distort their bottom line. So he contacted ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, to urge them to get companies to reveal how much JobKeeper they'd received. That move exposed these companies to public scrutiny.
If they hadn't done that, we perhaps would never have known that some of the largest companies in Australia were so well supported by JobKeeper and that they had basically padded their profits with it.
Many of these businesses will say to you, look, it was stimulus. It stimulated our profits. That's why we ended up doing so well. What's wrong with a profitable business?
Nothing is wrong with a profitable business, and taxpayers don't need to make them more profitable. It was sold as a scheme that would keep people in work and would provide income support for those people who were stood down. Our children will be paying back that money for generations to come.
The ASIC intervention revealed many well-known public companies clearly profited from receiving JobKeeper payments. Retailers like Harvey Norman and Best & Less, and luxury car dealer AP Eagers, just to name a few. Of course, by accepting the money, these businesses haven't done anything illegal. But even still, they were far too shy to join us on the program to talk about it. It might surprise you to know that publicly listed companies account for only 3% of the total JobKeeper. The rest is in the hands of private companies. Other beneficiaries include private schools, charities, and even churches.
Yeah, who knew that priests were employees? In fact, the rules were changed to allow priests to claim JobKeeper. We know that there's been about 140 private schools that have revealed the amount of JobKeeper that they've received. So many, like something like 90% of them, didn't experience a 30% downturn.
This is Hale, the oldest private boys' school in Perth. In the year before COVID, it recorded a surplus of $2.9 million. But last year, during a pandemic, that figure rocketed to $8.5 million. 7.45 million of that was all JobKeeper. Now, the school motto here is duty, to do what's right and give back. So will they? Well, like so many other businesses that have profited from this public money, they don't want to talk publicly about their amazing windfall. While JobKeeper's big winners prefer silence and are seemingly indulged by the government, spare a thought for people like Jan Raab, who've become the easy targets for Canberra's wrath.
The reality is that people knew of their obligations.
Jan made an honest mistake. She didn't anticipate the JobKeeper allowance she received would tip her over the limit she's entitled to earn while on a part pension. But she's prepared to pay it back. How does the Treasurer say, look, you knew about your obligations, you were supposed to know, and yet all those companies that made billions didn't have any obligations by the looks of things?
Well, it seems sadly that there's two rules in our society, one for the filthy rich and one for the poor. And if the poor can be chased, they're chased. Explain to me why these people with so much money are not being asked to do exactly the same. And even if they aren't forced to do it, out of sheer goodness of humanity in the middle of a pandemic, they should be paying it back. It's very un-Australian. It's un-Australian.
It's hard to argue Jan's point. And that probably explains why the creator of JobKeeper,
And this new 15...
Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, wouldn't be interviewed. But Finance Minister Simon Birmingham is made of sterner stuff, and from home quarantine in Adelaide, agreed to talk. We invited Josh Frydenberg to explain to us what went wrong, but he seems to have thrown you under the bus instead. What are we to make of that? The government is proud of JobKeeper and says it's why the Australian economy recovered so strongly. The scheme saved 700,000 jobs, but cost $89 billion.
I'm absolutely certain that JobKeeper has saved lives in this country. And so
Now, though, questions are being asked why 157,000 companies claimed $13 billion in JobKeeper payments when their businesses, far from declining, actually grew during the pandemic. Finance Minister Simon Birmingham took on the unenviable job of attempting to explain the illogical. Minister, thanks very much for doing this. We invited the architect of JobKeeper, Josh Frydenberg, to explain to us what went wrong, but he seems to have thrown you under the bus instead. What are we to make of that?
Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk about just how much went right. JobKeeper was a program designed to save the jobs of so many Australians, and it did just that at a time of enormous national crisis when the whole country was facing enormous uncertainty and potential lockdown. We saw that JobKeeper stepped up to the mark and saved, by Reserve Bank estimates, 700,000 Australian jobs.
Minister Birmingham is right. Plenty of jobs were saved. But as early as June last year, Treasury had identified billions of taxpayer dollars going to companies whose turnover was increasing. The big question is why it did nothing to tighten the eligibility rules to make it tougher to qualify until September last year. Let's say, look, OK, it was exceptional circumstances. You had to put this in fast and in a hurry. So when did you discover that this scheme was leaking so badly?
I don't accept the characterisation in your question, but what we did as JobKeeper went on was, after the first stage of JobKeeper, we refined the eligibility criteria through the second and third stage.
Treasury released a report not quite 3 months after this thing first started, and it identified, I'm taking it you've read that report, that 15% of the businesses that were getting these billions of dollars in public money were in fact not experiencing a downturn, had no downturn, but had a rise in their sales. Have you seen that report? Did you see it at the time? And what did you do in response?
That type of evidence from Treasury is precisely why, as a government, we then, going into the September quarter, made sure that we refined the eligibility criteria further for JobKeeper.
So you knew the money was wasted?
Through was to make sure that we listened to the evidence along the way, tightened the operations of the program, because at that stage we then had the time and the capacity to do so.
You knew then, 3 months afterwards, that 15% of these businesses that were getting it didn't deserve it. What measures did you take then to claw that money back?
We changed the eligibility criteria.
What about the public money that was already given? It's not your money, you realise that, don't you? You are on the public purse. We're paying you.
Yes, I don't need smart-ass questions, thanks. Of course I realise these are taxpayer dollars, and with taxpayer dollars, it is important that we always look after them. And what we were looking after were Australian taxpayers, people who had paid taxes through their working lives, and making sure that they would get support through the JobKeeper program.
The Minister has just described hard-working Australians like Jan from Frankston. But unfortunately, his words are not matched by the government's actions. It continues to single out individuals, demanding they return JobKeeper funds they weren't entitled to, while at the same time allowing companies to keep the money they didn't need. Currently, you're making 11,000 of these Australian taxpayers pay back the money they got from JobKeeper because the ATO says they were overpaid. Well, you overpaid 157,000 companies, $13 billion. Why don't you go after them and make them pay it back?
We are actually going after the companies who wrongly claimed or overclaimed against the eligibility criteria as it stood. We're chasing down around $300 million from Australian companies. Now, you're asking me, should we go back and retrospectively change the rules that were in place at the time? If we did that, then why would anybody have confidence in these sorts of programs in the future?
Is that an admission that you got it wrong when you put it out, that you should have had a clawback clause in the plan, that you should have stipulated that if people didn't need it, if their sales went up, if their forecast was wrong, to the tune of $13 billion in aggregate, that we should get that public money back? Are you or any other senior member of this government ever going to admit that?
No, because if we had put in place the types of provisions that created uncertainty about eligibility, then more Australian companies would have laid off more Australians from their jobs at the time.
What?
The point
You're
of the
kidding.
program.
You are joking. Yeah, what? If you had have put in a provision that was fair and reasonable and just, people who were getting public money, if you had to put a provision in, are you saying they wouldn't have taken the money?
There's a lot of rewriting of history going on by people who seem to forget the great uncertainty that existed at the time and the fact that there was a huge cry for government intervention to save businesses and save jobs, and to do it as urgently as possible.
Whether it's down to public shaming or because they want to do what's right, some of Australia's biggest companies are handing back some of their JobKeeper payments.
Pepperoni with jalapenos.
Domino's CEO Don May has given back $1.7 million.
Thanks, guys.
$1.7 million, that's a heck of a lot of pizzas. We attempted to keep it.
So when I proposed it, we had unanimous support. So it wasn't a hard decision from the board when we got to that point. It was the right decision. So I feel pretty good about that.
Other companies doing the right thing include Toyota, Santos, Iluka Resources and Nine. And a few days ago, even the very profitable Harvey Norman came to the party and gave back $6 million. But it's only a tiny fraction of what's still out there. You have no legal obligation to pay this money back. It's a big cheque to make out to Mr. Frydenberg, isn't it?
Once that clarity came out, once we were well through that early phase of that initial crisis, we said, well, look, it's the right thing to do. And so we did.
Should the government then encourage businesses to give it back if they've made those profits?
Look, we're not a political organisation, we're a pizza company, and pizza companies, I've got to be careful on what I comment on. I think it's okay for governments to make statements like that if that's what they believe in, that's up to the government.
Jan Raab says she too is doing her bit for the economy, paying back the $1,000 of JobKeeper she innocently but wrongly thought she was entitled to. The part pensioner doesn't have much to begin with, so she'll have to make sacrifices. But she's determined to stay out of trouble with Canberra. She worries, though, for those who have even less than she does.
I feel for all the people out there that are on the bottom end of town financially, with families to look after, and it's really hard for them to pay it back, even if $1,000 may not sound a lot to some people.
It's a strange old system that was put in place that didn't have a rule built into it for companies to pay back all this money.
Well, look, everybody was floundering at the time. Everybody was making up things as they went along, hoping for the best, and, probably things perhaps were overlooked.
But no one's going to admit it, are they?
Apparently not. No, but stop picking on people who can't afford to pay it back. Have a bit of heart.
Hello, I'm Tom Steinfort. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our Extra Minutes segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes on 9now.com.au, as well as the 9Now app.